Okay, it's my pleasure and honour to have not one but two head geeks with me today, Sasha Geese and Kevin KLINE, who are joining us for a deep dive series in database personas, how this works, what they relate to in terms of database administration, and the tooling that's relevant for them. And my name is Mark Roberts. I'm the Technical Director here at Prosperon Networks. We are partners for SolarWinds in the UK and around the world. And for the last 18 years, my focus has been very much on SolarWinds and being what I refer to as an enterprise monitoring specialist. And with that, I'm very much here to help and guide our customers to put a good installation of SolarWinds and many other tools in place. Today, as I say, I have Sasha and Kevin. So my job here is really just to chair and let them speak. So first of all, I'll introduce Sasha. Sasha Geese, good afternoon.
Hi there, my name is Sasha and I'm one of SolarWinds head geeks. And yes, you're right, there's two of us in this session. And I'm the so-called international guy. So I deal with Europe, EMEA overall and APJ. And today I represent the IT generalist and maybe the accidental DBA, but then I leave.
Thank you very much for that, Sasha. I think that you're going to be doing more than that. You're very much more than the IT generalist. And Kevin, good afternoon. If you'd like to say hello and introduce yourself.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I live in the beautiful city of Nashville, Tennessee, and I have been involved with databases since the mid-'80s. So I still kind of deep in my heart have a curmudgeonly belief that Fortran is the best programming language of all. And but I've been staying with relational databases since they were brand new. And I'm happy to be here today to kind of play the part of that expert DBA who spends a lot of time thinking about data and performance, as opposed to Sasha's more broad focus on keeping the whole infrastructure up and running.
And that's very much around these personas. It's identifying the fact that we have a DBA specialist and we have an IT generalist. The requirements and the function that you both provided in your careers are completely different. And this is very much what we want to talk about in this series. So from that point of view, you can see from our agenda, we're going to take you through, have a look at what we consider to be common personas. Clearly, there are many more, but the four that we have on here are things that we see in terms of how people are monitoring their environments, monitoring their databases, how those databases fit in to the services that they are providing functionality for. A little bit on Prosperon. So Prosperon are SolarWinds partners, have been for over 16 years. We provide a lot of functionality to our customers, pretty much handhold everybody from start to finish and make sure that they're getting everything they can. We've done a lot of good work across the board, and most of our work is around helping, let's say, with deployments, design improvements, and also more advanced functionality such as integration to third-party solutions, as well as including our managed services. Now, the database tooling, you can see from the slide that we have on the screen at the moment with regards to these four common personas. In my experience, and certainly working with the organizations that we do, there's lots of them of different sizes, flavors, public sector, private sector. What we are looking at achieving in this deep dive series is very much around the reality of how these users and these personas manage and have to manage and get involved in database administration. They all have different challenges, they all have different needs, and there's very much a different approach that's going to be necessary for each of them. So we're going to take this series to kind of have this deep dive insight into that, and certainly leverage the knowledge, expertise and experience that Sasha and Kevin can bring to demonstrate, let's say, that tooling definition. Now, Kevin, Sasha, from your point of view, I'm interested to hear kind of your stories about how you both first got involved in database management. Certainly from a IT generalist, that kind of first one that we're going to be talking about, this accidental DBA. Sasha, would you like to go first?
Well, I think my first personal experience was playing around with actually a SharePoint and wondering why things doesn't work. So I looked at the database, but it didn't really tell me anything back in those days. But obviously, starting at SolarWinds and dealing with customers basically 5 days in a week, there were loads of problems which we tried to solve with our tools, and they came to us with real world problems. And it's very nice if we were able to provide the tools to help themselves, basically. And that was kind of my angle where I came from. And meanwhile, I'm kind of like deploying SolarWinds in my own environment. And now I know a little bit more what a database does as opposed to a couple of years back with the SharePoint.
Yeah, and that certainly resonates with myself. My first exposure to databases was the fact that there was an application that needed a Microsoft SQL backend. Up until that point, I've been using Access. And so needing to manage and install this new application, get all of that configured, it needed to go against a database server. So that then opened my world to having to learn that application as well. Kevin, how about yourself, sir?
Well, I must be the oldest person in the room here, since I started at a time when a 286 was the leading edge technology in those days. And you were thrilled to have 512 kilobytes of RAM, very, very different times back then. And kind of at the cusp of the decline of mainframe computing. And so I learned how to administrate labs. I was a lab administrator at one of the computer labs at college. And in college, I learned Fortran and was very good at it. And I also was a little bit more forward thinking than some of my colleagues who only learned what they had to in class. I had independently decided to learn about these new relational databases. And so I was able to combine those two skills of knowing how to write a select statement, which was very new in the mid-'80s, and also being able to use Fortran code to write conditional processing for SQL statements, because I hadn't invented stored procedures yet. And so I was able to parlay that into a job at NASA. And so I worked on the team that built the water recycling system that's in use in the International Space Station today. And that was the start of my career. For the first 6 years, I was primarily a developer. So I wrote a lot of front-end code and a lot of back-end code. And then in the early 90s, I moved to one of the big 4 accounting and consulting firms of the world, and started to work on the relational database systems there, and led the SQL Server team for many years as well. So working at very high-end, for the day, high-end database applications throughout my career. And one of the things I discovered all through those early years was that there were very few good tools for managing database systems. And so later on in my career, that became one of my passions, is to think of myself as a senior DBA and think about what kind of tools can we create to make this person more effective and more capable. So I've been in the tools industry ever since the early 2000s.
Fantastic. I don't think we can compete with first job being at NASA. Sasha, no? No.
Well,
okay.
I can throw in Activision Blizzard, but it's not NASA.
That's pretty cool, actually. Yeah, and I love your dedication to carrying that on in your personal life as well with your gaming. Fantastic. Well, thank you both for that. Okay, so on to a bit of an understanding about our first persona, and this is pretty much our starting point. It's often referred to as an accidental DBA. It could be that enforced DBA, that engineer that's been given the task of, here you go, there's an application here, database, go and fix it, it's not working. And also that occasional DBA that's going to jump in and take the reins when necessary. So we're going to have a look at the aspects around the tooling, the differences. There are a number of tools in the SolarWinds arena, and so we'll have a look and see what tools are appropriate, what information is necessary and relevant for this persona. So straight away, from my point of view, my first exposure to databases, as I said before, was kind of having this application, having then a database backend that supported the application, it's a CRM platform as it was. And so the big stress point that first hit me was the fact that I had to kind of restore it. There was a problem. Somebody had made some database updates through the web application, and I was then asked to restore a database. And let me tell you, when you've just spent a huge amount of money putting the application in, and the data that's been populated and the time that's been spent, that was a pretty stressful part of my first exposure to being a DBA. So from that, very much from the point of Sasha here, how have you kind of had to get involved in dealing with those challenges? What knowledge have you had to kind of take on board in that first instance?
I think at the very beginning it is kind of like learning a new language. There's loads of terms which doesn't make any sense, and you need to learn and get at least a basic understanding of what's happening there. Maybe even a basic understanding what's happening in application delivery, what part talks with what part, that gets you in the right mindset to understand what a database is actually doing. And obviously, when you mentioned it already, the what did you say? The enforced DBA. It sounds so dangerous. So obviously, if you are in such a position, and it's true. So as a system administrator, someone might grab you and, hey, this is a database, deal with it, right? It's pretty similar in the network world that a network engineer is going to be tasked with security, just for whatever reason, and we see this obviously in database administration too. And well, it's a different language. There's loads of tools out there. We come to that in a moment, I guess. And even there, it's finding the right is pretty difficult. And as humans, we tend to, hey, I want to see everything. I want to do everything. But for starters, that is the wrong approach. It might be much better to start with a tool that is less complex, that provides loads of assistance. And I think we're going to show this in a couple of minutes.
Yeah, and certainly with regards to that kind of first backup and restoration process I had to go through, I had no idea, for example, what a transaction log was at that point. So when I restored it and not all of the data was there, it's then kind of trying to find out, well, where's the rest of this data, that panic that's kind of hit me, and then finding out from phoning a friend that knew more than I did, that mentor, that then gave me the visibility of, okay, I've restored the database, but now I've got to replay essentially all the transactions that have taken place since that backup occurred.
And this is so common, Mark, too. In fact, I was just on Reddit in the SQL Server thread 2 days ago, and one of the posters there pointed out that they're having a lot of trouble restoring their backup. But what they really meant, to Sasha's point, with all the jargon that we have to learn, they thought copying a file was a backup, but that's not the case with relational databases.
Yeah, and that whole configuration aspect around, well, you've got a file, you put it in the location, but that doesn't mean it's mapped and it's configured and the security around it is in place.
And this is so unfortunate, because if you just follow like tutorial in the internet, it's like detach the database, move over the file, attach it. But there's 1 or 2 more steps, right?
That's right.
Yeah. And knowing when that error comes up, because invariably it's going to at some point, what does that actually mean? How do you relate your existing knowledge to what the error message says? So, Kevin, I know I've heard you speak about this previously, about the importance of data, and I don't think it can be understated in all honesty, that the data is pretty much one of the most valuable assets in an organization, short of the people, obviously, you and I. And so from that point of view, how do you feel that the tooling at this level is appropriate for a DBA to be working with?
You know, the first time I ever encountered this idea about data being the true asset rather than other aspects of IT technology, I was still a developer at the time, but I was kind of the savviest developer on our team in terms of knowing how to write SQL code and understanding the internals of the database. And we had spent a lot of time and energy, hundreds of thousands of dollars, to pick the very best server architecture that we could. This was back when a company called Compaq still existed, if you remember them. And so we did this large benchmarking and troubleshooting session. And then after we determined our architecture and spent, again, hundreds of thousands on the servers that we needed, we had our first server crash. And I just knew that the CIO was going to call, very harsh tones, and say, what about my server? How soon can you get my server back up and running? You know, we spent a fortune on this, so when can I get it? And instead, what happened was, when I did get the call, what the executives wanted to know was not the server. They wanted to know how soon they could get access to their data once again. And it kind of blew my mind at that time. I had really always thought about the big things that we were spending money on, the big ticket items like the servers. I thought that was the IT asset. But in fact, it was the data itself. And so what we do see now is a number of new features and capabilities always being added to the database vendor platforms like SQL Server, like Oracle, and so forth. But then we also see the tools seeking to kind of bridge the gap between that emergency moment when you have a server go down and that moment you can get users back into the system and actually being productive again with the databases. And so that's where Sasha and I as head geeks come into the story, because we've spent the last many years of our career trying to build out different kinds of tools that will tell you in advance that performance is starting to look unusual, anomalous, outside of the norm.
And that's a really good point, because again, from my experience, and this still happens at this level of DBA, this kind of really low level accidental DBA, where somebody's they got Microsoft SQL Server, but they may also have a MariaDB, a MySQL DB, even things like Postgres or Mongo. So having different vendors and different database servers, there's a lot to learn. So certainly having tooling that kind of hides the background configuration and presents data in a uniform manner so they can kind of work through that with a consistent view has a huge amount of benefit for me. So I just at this point, it'd be a good point for us to cut across. Let's go and have a look at some tools and let's see them in action. What we want to have a look at here is the difference between the two primary tools in the SolarWinds suite that are focused towards this accidental DBA. The first one's going to be the Orion Server and Application Monitor module, and then the second one will be the DPA, and how both of these are going to come together and provide the level of visibility which we feel is very much appropriate for this level. So Sasha, over to you for your presentation there, if that's okay.
All right, let's jump into a demo. Before we started with this call, we considered what are we going to show, and we would have loved to use our demo environments, but there's just not enough stress on the database. So what we use here is the SolarWinds public demo system, and this is actually a website where everyone can jump in and get a feeling for the software. Now, we're talking about the accidental DBA, the system administrator who's taking over or taking on database administrative tasks. What we see here is a SharePoint. So let's assume a situation. Let's assume that company whatever is using a SharePoint, and we know that SharePoint nowadays is primarily used for sharing documents, working on documents for collaborations, and there might be complaints. There might be a ticket that performance is a little bit slow, whatever. So it's like the back of sweets. You open it, you don't know what you get. So what we see here on the screen is Server and Application Monitor going to monitor SharePoint Server 2016. This would be the first step. We check if SharePoint is okay. And we see here that everything is green. There's lots of information. Everything is green and fine. So what is the next step? Obviously, SharePoint being part of a three-tier approach. So we have a database in the background. And if you look at the right-hand side of the screen, we see an element called AppStack environment. Now, what is that? AppStack basically provides the relation of different elements across multiple layers in a typical IT environment. And obviously, SharePoint talks to a database, and I see a red element here. And if I hover over there, I should see something. Yes, there it is. It is the Microsoft SQL Server being read. So what is happening here? I click, and it will open a SQL in a moment.
So I saw there when you hovered over that there was a reference to work files. It was showing as red. So clearly the guidance that we're getting from the interface there is that this is the one that's likely causing the problems. We've got memory, we've got work files, they're both showing red.
Yes, there's a couple of red elements in the SQL Server. So we click from the SharePoint to the SQL, and we will see lots of information here. What is it actually? So At the left-hand side, we see all the databases running on this instance. And we already see that the search service, which is part of SharePoint, is red. And if I scroll further down, we probably see a few more red elements. The logging, the SharePoint logging is red too. But I don't want to drill into a database right now. I still check on what is happening here. Mind you, I'm the accidental DBA. Maybe I see this for the first time. It's unlikely. I probably see it for the 10th time, whatever. But just imagine that someone would see this for the very first time, okay? And as Kevin mentioned earlier, the jargon is a problem, and there's loads of elements of key performance indicators or metrics, which we see. And most of this is green, but we saw some red elements, and we see it here. At the right-hand side, work files created in a second. Now, what is that actually? And we would like to provide loads of assistance at this stage and provide an explanation. Okay, so performance counter details. Now at the right-hand side, I think I can zoom a little bit into this. We see an explanation, and we provide a lot of assistance here. So the user will understand what is happening, why is it happening, and what is a possible remediation. And that is actually very important information, because at this stage, I could decide if I want to move on and try to fix it on my own, or if I'm going to ring Kevin, for example. Kevin, what would you do right now?
Well, knowing that we're looking at work files created, that tells me that a lot, to be honest, because I'm experienced and I've learned all these things. So as you point out, this is a teaching interface. One of the reasons that accidental and enforced DBA struggle so much is, as you pointed out, they don't know the jargon, but then they also don't know how to actualize the information they're given. It's a red indicator. What does that mean? So in this case, knowing what I know, I would say, okay, well, we have some issues with TempDB and TempDB speed. So now I need to figure out one of two things. Is it queries that are overusing TempDB, or is TempDB seriously under-provisioned, and we need to improve or increase the resources that are provisioned to TempDB?
Yeah, and for checking the resources, we could actually fall back and use the same tool which we look at right now, but I don't want to go there. Instead, I go a step back, and we can have a look at the database.
And certainly with regards to that correlation there, so as you just said, Sasha, you've got this expert guidance. It's giving you the visibility that this could be disk performance related, this could be memory related. So again, if I was taking this from an accidental DBA, my first thing would be to take that guidance and then go and have a look at the performance metrics of the servers, see how much memory is being used, have a look and see what the disk I/O is. That's all available in Orion when we're monitoring the server object.
You're absolutely right. We could just click the server on top where my mouse is right now. I'm not going to do this here, but we could just click there. And actually, we see, even in the pop-up here, we see that the memory, there's lots of memory pressure going on, which could be a very good explanation for the situation.
Quite a boring one for this example, wouldn't it? So let's go and find something a bit more interesting.
Yeah, it's too obvious. So let's open a database here. And as I mentioned earlier, we are currently on instance level. So I'm now going to drill down into an individual database and let's see what's happening there. Again, there will be loads of information showing, but again, if we click on an individual metric, we would get an explanation. And this is actually quite cool. We see the database size, we see the transaction log, we see the volume usage. This is actually very interesting. I've seen many problems caused by lack of disk space. Would you believe something as basic, but it caused issues. And yeah, sometimes it's just the obvious stuff, right? We're not looking at the obvious things. And we see loads of information here, and somewhere, I think on top we saw the disk I/O. Okay, so back to Kevin's point, this could be an issue here. Our example is green, so It's perfectly fine. So what we sometimes would see is index and index fragmentation. It's not showing here in this database. Maybe it's disabled, but we would see if indexes are, or if there might be a reorg as a good idea. We talk about that in a couple of minutes. Anyway, I'm scrolling down. We see expensive CPU queries at the right-hand side based on CPU time. So I could populate, and we will see the query here. Now, on the level where we are right now, this is probably maybe this is even too much. But we see at least the CPU cycles caused by a query. So this basically is server and application monitor, which allows us to monitor the application itself. In our example, it was a SharePoint, and have a good understanding of what's happening inside a database. Again, we can click on any metric for more information for this training or learning effect, if you would like. And we could definitely move on to maybe the server, if there was an issue with the server, but also we could drill down to a different level. So if I go a step back.
Now, one thing that's interesting about this, Sasha, is that a lot of the inexperienced or accidental DBA types will fall back on the standard perfmon counters that you will see in Task Manager. And again, that's actually a problem. It's one of these things that confuses and throws a lot of people off the proper trail. So, for example, we see there percent memory used is 90%. That seems like it's bad because we're used to looking at, say, the metric just above that, CPU load, commonly called like CPU busy. The percentage of CPU consumed, when it hits 90%, that's a big concern for us because it's unusual for SQL servers to run that hot in terms of CPU. But it doesn't actually correlate to memory. So if you rely on something like Task Manager on a SQL Server database, you'll always see as much memory used as the server has. And so Task Manager says SQL Server or SQL Server and SharePoint, whatever your app server is, together are consuming 95% of the server memory. And initially you would think, oh, that's bad. But in fact, because relational databases control their own memory management, they always want to have as much memory as you can give them. So that actually indicates at a server level something that would take us down the wrong trail if we don't know that relational databases will always do that. And that's why you have to drill down to the next level that tells us what's happening inside of SQL Server or Oracle or Postgres, what have you. We need to know how that relational database is actually using the memory. It looks like memory pressure at the server level with those old-fashioned tools, but in fact it is not. That is natural and normal behavior of a relational database.
Touching on that as well, Kevin, certainly with regards to this external to DBA, they're not always going to be aware of this fact that SQL Server will just grab all the memory that it can, and that there's a setting within SQL Server which you can restrict it. So rather than SQL and the OS fighting for that memory and causing performance degradation, that's where you then need that visibility. You need to have that understanding about the memory configuration, as you say, the use of that memory on the server and within the application. That information is critical to make an informed decision truly about memory.
Exactly right. And, as we saw, there were different alarms and so forth on cache. Well, caching is what SQL Server does, as well as the other relational databases within their own memory management. So, again, I didn't know that jargon. I didn't know that memory on the outside of SQL Server, on my server, is managed in one way, but inside of my SQL Server, the terminology is around caching, and so that's what we need to pay attention to. And that's also one of the things that's really great about these tools is that they teach you what these jargon-laden terms are and how to apply them to your actual real-world experience.
I think I read somewhere that it's suggested to limit SQL memory to 80% of the machine memory, but that doesn't make too much sense because it's very dynamic, based on what memory is available at all and how much pressure is on the machine. But
Yes.
what we should do in any way in this example here, and that is what Kevin just mentioned, those 90% might be perfectly fine. So it might be a good idea to adjust this performance counter to turn into green. If the machine works perfectly fine with 90%, there's no reason to make it shine in green.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly with regards to this SQL Monitor, this App Insight for SQL Monitor within SAM, I know from talking to our customers, when they first kind of enable this on their SQL servers, there's a sea of red that comes up. And they're all kind of, oh my goodness, things are broken. What have I got to fix? That's really not always the case. Those metrics are kind of the vendor guidance numbers. They're not necessarily the real world. They're not necessarily the numbers that make sense for you and how you're using that database technology. So again, those expert guidances are very much there for you to take those KPIs, take those kind of things that are showing as red and yellow, and identify and map it to your use of it, not just the generic, this is bad.
A great point, Mark. One of the things that you learn over time is that the only thing that's worse than a very serious critical alarm going off and you not addressing it, that's about the worst thing you could do. But what's just slightly less bad than that is having lots of critical level alerts go off that really don't mean this is a critical situation. We call that noise. And so when you have very noisy alerting systems based on your monitoring, at the end of the day, you are almost back to square one in that you are not getting any actionable, useful information because you're inundated with too much useless information. So the fact that Sasha could go in and change a threshold from showing from red to green is extremely important. And that's one of the things that Prosperon can do for you as a vendor is that they can help you go through the process of making sure that you only ever get useful and actionable alarms rather than all of these red lights and yellow lights going off that are something you have to ignore. And once you start to filter those alarms out, you are very, very much more likely to miss a very important, truly critical alarm that goes off.
Yeah. And it's a critical part of any deployment of a monitoring solution. It's taking what is out of the box and then tuning it for your needs. As you say, if you've got a whole bunch of alerts being generated and you look at it and go, oh my God, I'm overwhelmed. Often we see that people will suddenly start disabling monitoring completely for that object. That's not the approach. We need to right size and we need to tune those numbers. When we were looking at work files as second value, if 40 actually is a good number for you, and for whatever reason that's right, then the threshold should be changed to 50 or something along those lines. That will immediately get rid of that critical threshold and it will show green. Sasha, one of the questions that I have for you here is SAM all that an external DBA needs? This kind of KPI-based approach, this metric-based approach?
No. At some point, we would like to use a different tool because we want to know a little bit more what is actually happening there. So I would say the Server and Application Monitor is a great first tool. In this situation, a great first tool because it will allow us to separate a problem like Kevin mentioned from the machine or maybe from our alerting system from a problem with a database. And depending on what's the root cause, we would move on into different directions. So, for example, right now, I'm back to the SQL Server, our instance, and at the left-hand side, there's a couple of icons. So one of those guys here, it's called DB Performance. I'm going to click this now, and what we see now is actually information coming from a different tool, but the metrics are forwarded into the Orion platform. So if someone is using both tools, this information will be available. The tool I'm talking about is called Database Performance Analyzer. And that is where things get a little bit more in-depth in regards to monitoring the database. So this is just for databases and not so much, in our example, for the SharePoint, for example. Not so much is an understatement. It wouldn't really mind any SharePoint information. So DPA comes with its own dashboard. What we see here is the information that's forwarded into the Orion platform. So if I click into queries or any other elements, it will open the different dashboard in a moment. So let me try to simulate this.
So what we're seeing on the screen here is not Orion source data. This is the separate application database performance analyzer injecting its data into the Orion web UI, so we don't have to navigate away.
Yeah, this is actually pretty cool. What we see now on the screen is actually information that's coming from DPA, and we see the response time of the query. We even see the SQL text at the bottom. And if I now click View in DPA, we are not going to drop the ball. Instead, we will see the information in DPA's own dashboard, but still focused on the query which we selected a moment ago.
One of the important things to point out that's very useful about the SAM tool in Orion that you're showing us here, Sasha, is that this is an excellent sort of way to manage your broader environment. So if, for example, your enterprise, your organization has a level 1 help desk, it's really, really useful to have this sort of information up on the screen all the time. Sort of a National Operations Center, a so-called NOC environment. And typically, when you have level 1 support, they are broad-based, just like an accidental DBA would be. And so when you look at the different metrics that you see, when you see something red go off, you can then make a decision, like Mark was saying in his earlier story, of, A, is this something I can resolve right now? Maybe it's just one of those simple warnings that says you have a disk that's approaching full. So maybe I need to provision more space for that. That's simple. That's something level 1 support might handle. But in Mark's case, he ran into a problem where he needed more help. He needed to call someone who really knew the internals of the system under investigation. So that's where we can use this tool to then basically click a button and provide for us a meaningful interface that provides a lot of additional information. So when we have the DPA view appear on the screen just a moment, that is simple enough to be very useful for that level 1 support. They could tell at a glance, maybe they need to bring in the development team, or maybe they bring in the DBA team, or it turns out maybe it's a disk problem and I need to bring in the SAN team. So it's very, very useful for that junior person to hand off to the next L2 level support. And then once we're in the DPA product, they can then choose, okay, am I going to do this myself? Or am I going to get the team lead involved to fix a SQL query? Something like that.
Okay, Sasha, I can see you've taken us into that link. We've got that immediate visibility as it relates to that journey path. Just in terms of keeping on track of this persona analysis and the tooling, I think it would be a good idea to keep it shorter and just take us back to the dashboard of DPA so we can just really concentrate on the features that are relevant for this accidental DBA. Is that okay?
Totally with you. And let's do this. Okay, so let's start from scratch. What exactly does DPA do? On a very basic level, two important bits of information. So first of all, we look at query wait time. It does analyze the wait time. What exactly is that? So you send a query into a database and at some point you get an answer. You should, hopefully. And each time a query is being processed, wait time being added in different steps. And we talk about milliseconds basically, but consider that there is parallel queries and the query is being executed like 100,000 times a day, whatever. So it is perfectly normal that in 24 hours of a day, the overall wait time might be well above that. So that is perfectly fine. But there are situations where this is not normal, and this is where another nice feature of this tool will come in. It brings an anomaly detection. So as an example, it could be possible that the wait time is really, really much higher than it usually is. But the system would be smart enough to understand that just the amount of queries is higher too. So, which is a nice explanation why something is a little bit slower, but it's kind of normal. Everything is within parameters. So this is actually quite nice. Also, it will create like a dynamic baseline in the background to identify those spots. And there's a couple more strong suits of this tool. So obviously it's focused on databases. It also has a very broad support of databases. We mentioned it earlier. I think Kevin mentioned like 1,000 different databases he dealt with in the past. And we do support with DBA, loads of them. You see a couple there on the screen. There's even Oracle, and there's a couple of exotic stuff like DB2, etc. So very broad support for different databases, which is very interesting if a business uses different databases in production, and that is something which we see frequently.
So what I love about what you've just said there, Sasha, is not just the fact that DBA supports monitoring multiple database technologies, but also DBA can be installed against multiple technologies. So if you are running Postgres and you're monitoring Postgres, you can install the DBA application against a Postgres database. So you've got that commonality of database technologies. So you're administrating it for your monitoring tool, and your monitoring tool is monitoring the same database technology in the background as well.
That's an excellent point, Mark. One of the really interesting things that we see now, it was happening decades ago, in fact, that many enterprises, particularly globally large enterprises, would have multiple database platforms in-house. And we call that a heterogeneous environment. And so one of the things that we see is that has accelerated over time, partly because of the strength of the open source database platforms like PostgreSQL is a very good product. MariaDB, MongoDB, MySQL, Cassandra, all of these different data platforms are open source, and they're good. And not just it used to be just the commercial databases like Sybase, like DB2, like SQL Server, like Oracle. Those were, for a long time, the only ones you would find in an enterprise environment. Now we see not just one or two commercial platforms in a big enterprise. We see most of them, and we see all of these open source databases as well. And so what we have here is a kind of a two-pronged situation where we have people who are generalists or accidental DBAs, but then we also have people who are very strong DBAs, but only on one of those platforms. And so maybe you're a member of the DBA team, your title is DBA, but you're not great at, let's say, PostgreSQL. You know Oracle really well. Well, in this case, one of the things that's very, very powerful about this tool set is you are equally capable of being a highly skilled DBA on all of those platforms at one time, because you only have to learn this one interface. Weight stats are in common between all relational databases. I don't have to learn the particular name for locking problems in terms of weight stats on Postgres and on Oracle and on SQL Server. I know that I have that covered in DBA. I don't have to learn those inner details. I know that CPU is covered. I know that memory or I/O is covered. So this gives us not just one pane of glass for the higher ups to see how our enterprise is operating, but also one performance tuning interface as well. And so this is extremely powerful and enabling, not just for the juniors, but also for the enterprise DBAs who perhaps have a specialty.
And certainly for the accidental DBA that we're talking about here, they don't have the time to learn 4 or 5 different data technologies. They are there to do a job, and they're kind of having to dip in and out of this technology stack when issues arise. They're mostly firefighters rather than real configurators. So even more important for this level is just that ease of ability to go in and get information out quickly, efficiently, to go and get that issue dealt with in a quick time as they go on and do other things.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's have a look at one or two of those things. And I'm opening a SQL server. This is actually an AG, so an availability group, but we are not interested in this fact right now. So I click into the server, and we see the start page of DBA in the server overview. And we just want to point out the interesting bits of information. And one of them is definitely the anomaly detection, which we briefly touched a few seconds ago. And here, if I scroll down, is the advisors, the query advisors. And this is actually gold because it will provide information as of what's the next step now as we are already focusing on the database level. And again, there's loads of assistance. So here, if I click how is this calculated, there's an element showing exactly where we get this information from and what does it mean. So this is also pretty cool if you would like to further look into what does it actually mean as of just looking at statistics. And I think Mark mentioned it, instead of just firefighting, fixing it, do some research. Obviously, this is time consuming. And not everyone is able to do this, particularly if something is red and something doesn't work as nice. But if you like to know more, this is a good point to start, as it will put you on the right track to further investigate or research databases. And in our example right now, it's a SQL server.
So the thing that I love about DBA in this instance, and I hear it from customers when we put it in, and they'll go, "Oh, well, we've got a database that's performing badly." Okay, we'll put a trial of DBA in, have a look and see what it returns. These advisories are basically DBA doing your accidental DBA work. I don't know how to firefight. I don't know how to analyze a query. I don't understand the structure of indexes and the importance of indexes to query structure. So the advisories are very much there to tell me. The application here is giving me a list and it's telling me the ones that are having problems, and it's giving me the guidance to say, actually, this is how you can fix it. So I don't need to have that knowledge. But then the great thing about is what you just said is I can learn from that, because when I come across an advisory and I look at it and I can look at the query and I can look at the advisory, I can now start to join some dots and immediately increase my knowledge. Okay, Sasha, that's fantastic. I really appreciate everything in terms of seeing what the tooling, both the server and application monitor and Orion, that journey through that application, giving us the KPI metrics, leading us into the database performance analyzer application, where we can now really go and have a look at the performance, the query performance, the weights that are being experienced on those queries, and also the way that both applications are giving us guidance on how I can understand this. I can make sense of this based on my limited knowledge, because I don't have that time, I don't have that capabilities of determining that for myself. The tools are giving me that information. That's fantastic. We've put some resources up here. This is very much the ability for you to go and have a look, have a play. Both of these applications can be installed in a trial, and so you can install it, you can play with it, you can populate it with your environment and really see how this can come together. Guys, anything you'd like to add?
You know, one of the things that we learn over a long career is that the right tool for the job makes everything about your professional experience better. Whether you're a carpenter or an architect or an IT person. So matching your requirements and your skill level with the right product can really amplify what you're able to get done. And so in this case, if you're a junior or a generalist when it comes to database systems and IT administration, we have tools that can make you incredibly productive. The question is, have you decided what kind of tools that you want to apply to the situation? And if that's yes, then let's take a look at the tools available and get you the right one for the job. It'll make an enormous difference in your career trajectory and your productivity.
That is right. And that applies to so many other jobs, like you mentioned, the carpenter, etc. Right? I think another popular example is image processing. Not everyone leads high-end software because there's so many features, and you need more time to figure out what do they do, instead of fixing or focusing on fixing the issue or creating something nice in case of images. So on the screen we see the links that Mark mentioned. As Mark mentioned already, there's trial versions available. You can try it out anytime. Obviously, those need to be installed. It's not like the demo system which we used, which is available just to get a quick intro. But those evaluations allow you to use your own environment. And this is pure gold. I think Mark probably has loads of stories to tell how users deploy DBA and finding issues within the first day. And unfortunately, not all of them buy the product later, but it's really useful.
But absolutely true. We have this discussion with many customers. The fact that it's so quick and easy, within an hour or so, you'll have it installed, you'll have it populated, and this data starts presenting itself, and that understanding is so quick and so immediate. Yep, whether installing it to firefight a particular issue, absolutely. If it's something that you see the value, and everything that we've discussed today is that value, then you're going to see that it's worth having in your tool set and your arsenal. Thank you very much, guys. Appreciate all of your insight and understanding, and I look forward to speaking to you when we talk about the next persona, which is going to be the junior DBA. And if you've liked anything you've seen on this series of database personas, please reach out to us. Our website, prosperon.co.uk, is certainly a method to contact. We also have a LinkedIn and Twitter location. You can find us on Prosperon. And we also have our YouTube channel, which actually may be where you're watching this video now.